Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Jen. How are you?
Good. It's been a long time.
I know. Good to see you.
You too.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. How are
Good.
you?
I'm doing fine,
I think we're
thanks.
waiting on one more person that's supposed to be in our group.
Hi.
Hi, Molly. Hi, David.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good. Well, let's go ahead and get started with introductions around the group that we have now. I think that Anya is also joining us, but hopefully she'll pop in. So I'm Sarah Johnson. I work with Tool Design here in Raleigh, and I am a landscape designer. My background is in city planning and landscape architecture, and I had the lucky fortune of working with Jen previously over at Stewart. So Jen, I'm going to nominate you to go next to introduce yourself.
Okay, thanks. I'm Jen Wagner. I am actually out on my own now. I own a firm called Prospect Landscape Architecture, and I'm the chair of the Parks Recreation Greenway Advisory Board.
You can pick who's next.
Oh,
Hot potato.
I saw Dan come up, so Dan, I'll pass it to you.
That's me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm the planning director of the North Carolina Museum of Art.
Great.
Very cool. I'll go next. I'm Molly Stewart. I have Urban Land Institute after my name. I don't work there. That's sort of the group I'm representing here. I am actually a real estate and zoning attorney in Raleigh, but previously a city planner. So right there with you, Sarah. And you'll hear that my kind of repeated focus, which is really more of a personal concern, is transportation. I come from elsewhere, and I used to only bike everywhere I went, and I found that a challenge. So I'm all about being able to get the places I'm going anyway.
Great. All right, David, it's you.
Yep. And I'm David Hamilton. I'm the Greenway manager. So I manage 4 different work groups that take care of all the maintenance on Greenway.
And we appreciate it, definitely. Okay, since Anya hasn't joined, I think we should go ahead and jump in. So the topic that we're going to be talking about in this breakout session is the trail classifications, which Jared was just talking about. So the 3 classifications, and I don't have any slides to present in this. We're just going to have a conversation. So the 3 classifications, one of them was the destination trails, and that's trails that are connecting destinations. So for example, that would be your Walnut Creek, your Crabtree Creek, Rocky Branch, those types of trails. The second one is more scenic trails and loops. And so that is more recreation based. It provides access to natural areas. And in terms of examples, that's more of the Neuse River Trail, the paths around Lake Johnson. The third one is local trails, and that essentially links to other trails and provides access to neighborhoods. So for example, that's Chavis Way or Edwards Mill. So the first question is, what do you think about reframing the trail classifications around user expectations?
Can you give an example of what you mean?
Sure. So for example, on the destination trails. So if you were told, this trail is going to get you across the city from, it's going to provide access to some major destinations, or the scenic trail, as a user, you're told this is going to be, a recreational asset. It's going to provide access to more natural scenic area. So when you hear that, what do you expect out of that trail? Like what type of characteristics in terms of the design, and that could be the trail width, the trail material, or what do you expect in terms of maintenance of that type of trail? What do you expect in terms of the amenities to be provided along that type of a trail? So you've got your destinations, your scenic, and your local trails.
I love this idea. I know there's been a lot of conversation about, sorry to harp on transportation, but to try to connect things that are important. And so when you do that, obviously the expectations are very different. That the snow will be cleared, and whatever happens will be fixed. And maybe it's wider at it, depending on traffic. Who knows? how that would work out, but certainly you would expect it to have a very high level of service compared to either of the other types really, but particularly the scenic, of course.
Mm-hmm. So the destination trail is saying more high level of service in terms of its upkeep and perhaps wider widths is what you're saying.
Yeah, just reliability becomes more of a factor for a trail like that one, where you're making a promise that it connects A to B, and you may need to get from A to B, and it's not just something you're doing on a Saturday for fun. And obviously it would be very challenging to try to maintain all of our trails to the level of you can expect to use it 24/7, no matter what. But that's a great way to sort of prioritize.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have thoughts on specifically the destination trails and what you would think of in terms of the characteristics or the amenities provided with that type of a trail?
Yeah, I mean, I think to jump onto what Molly was saying, the destination trails would, I think, give the idea that it's a little more transportation oriented. And so that on the flip side of what she was saying about making sure that there's, good amenities and that it's clearly marked, also as like a mom of a couple little kids, I might avoid that trail and go to more of the recreation trail to if I'm just out on a Saturday and I'm just wanting to ride around and I'm not wanting to get, tied up with folks that are like out trying to get to the grocery store and run errands. So I could see that distinction might be helpful in that way. I honestly am not completely sold on this whole idea at all. And I'm not sure it's really worthwhile. I think that it's helpful to know generally where trails are going, and it's helpful to make sure that the segments are completed and to fill the gaps in the trails. But getting too hung up on like where does this one fit in the categories, and what is this, and is this a destination, or is this a local, or is this a regional? I don't know. I'm not sure that really helps me anyway with the day-to-day, and with ultimately I feel like we just need funding for the trails to fix gaps. And if it helps us receive funding, because that's what I'm thinking is like, okay, if we can say this is a destination trail, so therefore we get DOT funding, then okay.
Or CMAC or
yeah.
In terms of saying that you aren't sure about the classifications, do you mean in general just classifying the trails, or do you mean classifying them based on user expectation?
I think in general.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think we often as designers and planners get a little too caught up in breaking things down and classifying things, and I think that hurt us before with the fact that the definition for the Greenway Trail was so limited that it caused issues. And so in some ways, I think it's helpful to be a little broader and not try to, break things into all these little buckets, because then we might in 10 years be like, ooh, why did we do that? Now this trail is considered to be a destination trail, and that's limiting us in some way.
Okay, I want to bring in some other voices on this. Dan,
Yeah,
looks like you were about to speak.
I think I would have to agree with that. Adding a subjective quality to the description of greenways, I think I don't see a big upside to it. What people really want to know is, how do I get from here to here? What's the degree of difficulty, perhaps? Is this appropriate for commuting? And am I going to feel safe? Those kinds of questions. I mean, even for cultural destinations like the one I run, I think that's what people mostly want to know, rather than, well, there are some experiential things like I mentioned, degree of difficulty. So it's very useful. My wife doesn't like to ride on hills. She likes rails to trails because they're flattish, but if they're very hilly, it's a turnoff to her and a lot of people. So that's maybe not subjective, but it's a kind of quality that people might appreciate.
Well, and I think that I think that this is a good conversation about subjective versus, more objective qualities of the trail. And you mentioned the challenging or the grade, essentially, the steepness of the trail, the terrain. But you also talked about whether or not it's appropriate for commuting. And so I think that that is something that it could be subjective, but it's generally more objective. So for example, I mean, if you were to expand upon that, what types of qualities would you say would be appropriate for a trail that's meant for commuting? That somebody who wanted to commute, get out of their car, take their bike, how would they know that that trail is going to be appropriate for that
Oh, well,
use?
as we're heading into the winter months, I think that the most common question is, I get out of work and it's dark. Is this going to be safe for me to ride?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So
and
lighting,
where does it lead? Where is my final?
Well, yeah. Can I get home safely?
mm-hmm.
Right.
I have a question for Jen and Dan, which is just, I don't know that we necessarily need sort of, clear, publicly made distinctions between the trails, but when it comes to practical issues such as maintenance and to what level are these maintained, how would we prioritize, right? And just decide, can we really maintain the entire system to a level that one could depend on for commuting? And if
So
not,
for
how do we-
example, if there's if we have a tropical storm or some kind of nor'easter come through and there's just debris and we know it's everywhere across the system, how do you pick which trails get cleared first?
I think that's a good question for David.
I could speak to that. So our focus is our three main, what I call the three main arteries, is Neuse River, Walnut Creek, Crabtree, and our lakes, because we see a lot of use around our loops. So kind of the way it's always worked for us, when we have flooding, our lakes we come back to because they hold the water the most. And normally by the time we finish Walnut Creek, Crabtree, and sections of the Neuse, the water's receded enough where we can get in there and start scraping and removing debris. So we kind of have it systematically the way we do it now, just because the way the water recedes, which one's the quickest.
Sounds like we sort of have priorities.
If it's a wind event or if it's a flood event, how we're going to react. But we try to give everything the same attention. But so like I've created a storm response where we break up into 3 groups. We have somebody who's from every team on a group. So we have construction, we have regular maintenance, we have our structure group and urban forestry groups represent on each one, so we can handle any of the issues that we come across, and we kind of work it that way.
We do categorize already. We just don't need to make a big deal of it, it sounds like.
Well, and it sounds like some of that categorization is based on the topography and the fact that these are along water bodies and in stream corridors. And if the system moves towards a more transportation-based system where we're not quite as tied to these stream corridors, then maybe there will be a change, or that will be adapted, if we have more roadway.
Well, I think that's one
greenways.
of the big issues. So I understand, like we're talking about destination, which is a Crabtree and Walnut Creek, and you want to prioritize if there's work out there, we need to make sure we keep these open. So it's not just a Greenway piece, it's also with the transportation group to make sure we have detours we can do. So like Structure 106 is a huge hot topic. That's because it's been down so long. And bicyclists can reroute, but we cannot advertise it because it's not safe for pedestrians, because it's not a crosswalk across Capitol right there. So those are the other issues that have to tie into it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and to Molly's point, if people are going to be using this as a way to get to work, there needs to be a clear detour, because I've had that happen before where we're out, for a weekend ride, and you just all of a sudden come upon a, Greenway closed and ahead, and there's no indication of what to do about it, which, if you're just out for a Sunday ride, that's okay. You kind of figure something out. But if you're trying to get to work at 9 o'clock, that could be a problem. So prioritizing which one of these are more for destination geared travel, transportation, geared travel makes some sense in that regard. Yeah. I think it would relate to usage as well. Did you say that was one of the things that you looked into for your criteria?
Right.
Yeah.
So like News River, it would not be, according to this listing, a destination, but it's one of our highly used trails.
Yeah.
So by putting it down as a local, if we're talking about service level, it wouldn't get less service than one of our destinations. So that I don't think we could break it up that way.
Mm-hmm. We had it as a scenic, but yeah, I mean, the question is just, I don't think we have determined necessarily, you know, we haven't determined what characteristics should go along with these trail classifications. That's why we wanted to have this conversation to ask, you know, if you're going to a scenic, what's considered a scenic trail, how would that guide you? So I think I want to ask, I think that this conversation of whether or not the classifications are necessary is a really good one. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time on that. So in terms of being able to guide the future development of greenways and figuring out, you know, what types of materials, what trail width is appropriate, what types of amenities should be provided on the trail, how, if you don't have a trail classification system, how would you determine those characteristics? Would it be case by case? Would it be, you know, based on the constraints? What would you recommend?
Right. I'm thinking more of kind of what Dan was suggesting of, you know, it might be rather than trying to say this entire section of Greenway is a transportation trail or a scenic trail. Instead, it's looking at maybe identifying this one gets a red stripe because it gets you to businesses, and this one gets a black diamond because it has steep hills. And so they kind of have little characteristics on the sign that help them to fall into different, so it's not so much you're saying that's a scenic trail, but it's rather just this has red and black diamond on it, and so that I know I can get to downtown, and it's going to be hard. And this one has, you know, whatever, the green square and blue, so I know I'm going to go along the river, and it'll be an easy ride, you know, and you kind of break it down into different categories.
I'd also like to make a case for the case by case. So they're not all equal, even within the same stretch. Long stretches that are relatively flat or gentle, they can generally be not quite as wide as, let's say, hilly and curvy. Because,
certainly.
Pardon me?
Oh, I wanted to say just, yes, certainly. I mean, from a design standpoint, especially for bicycles.
Well, this is right. So we have a huge number of incidences for our, as we call it, our dead man's curve. as it enters a park from our major bridge. And so, you know, a lot of lessons learned there. And I have visited many, many greenways that are expanded up to 14, 16 feet, depending on the amount of usage that they get, measured on the peak times, like Saturdays. So even on the Reedy Creek Trail, you know, there could be narrower and wider sections. But again, I think that a good analysis of each section so that it feels safe and is safe is the key, and that should dictate its width, rather than saying it's this type of trail and so it's going to be X, Y, or Z. I don't know if that makes sense. Another key strategy I think that I've seen very successfully deployed is where wide gravel shoulders that are really well made effectively double the usage of a trail without adding double the cost, and makes runners, let's say, feel much more comfortable. So in those kind of situations, and again, I'm the most familiar with the park that I run, adding those kinds of amenities, which might have its own symbol. So it might have a runner and a cyclist that are, you know, I know that everybody's welcome to use all trails, but ones that are specifically designed in high use areas, that might be a designation that, again, is not subjective, but is one that encourages a feeling of safety, you know, if you're pushing a stroller or whatever your situation is. And that comes down to what I've observed from users is their number one thing, other than that it's a great walk or a great run or whatever they're doing, is that they feel safe and they don't get lost.
Okay, yeah, so I'm hearing in terms of amenities, well, I'm hearing a couple of things about signage. One, that when we think about amenities, we're thinking a lot about signage to make sure that folks know what to expect and they know where they're going. And what I mean by what to expect, they know like who's allowed to use it, if it's going to be steep and hilly, but also where it's going to connect you. But the other thing that I'm kind of hearing is that in terms of the trail classifications, that building the network is the most important thing, is kind of what I'm hearing out of Jen, and that if you just tell people build it based on the constraints that you have, and then tell people what that experience is like, rather than necessarily trying to frame it the other way.
Right,
Because we have a little bit of the chicken and the egg. Sorry, I've got the virtual background. So my hands popped out of nowhere. So a little bit of, you know, when we have existing trails, that kind of technique I can see working very well. But what about when we're creating an entirely new trail that's not been on the map before? You know, how do we know how to build that? You know, rather than coming behind and saying this is already along a creek, so here's the
right. Sarah, I guess I'm curious what brought you guys as the experts together to sort of decide that made sense to break it into. Was it mostly because you were looking for a way to figure out, like you said, how many amenities, you know, so that you could kind of have a framework to say recreational trails or scenic trails require a bench every half mile versus transportation trails require one every quarter mile or something?
Yeah, so part of it is just looking at the existing trail classifications, and there's about 5, although there's like a sub classification, and just seeing the way that they are organized. And those classifications essentially say, you know, this is a you know, if it's a link, then, or sorry, not a link, they would call it a connector. And it says, you know, the typical width is this amount. These are the types of materials that are appropriate. So for example, some of the more, the loops and trails that exist right now, that classification, you can have like crushed granite. It can be a natural material, whereas that would not be an appropriate surface material for for some of the, I think they're called crosstown trails or cross city trails.
Right.
So building essentially off of, we have these trail classifications, and they tell you what types of amenities that might be provided. They tell you what types of the material, the width. We said, well, it's not useful necessarily that they are so similar. There's so much overlap between them. And so we said, well, how would we break that apart and move it into being something? I mean,
I get why that exists, but I do feel like, especially at this point, with the fact that we have so much of our Greenway built, and at this point we're missing a lot of little connecting segments. So it feels like maybe those guidelines aren't quite as necessary, because instead.
Nope. Did we lose her?
Oh, you have 48 seconds.
Okay, we lost her, but I just wanted to say that thank you all for this input. We are going to meet back together in the second breakout, so we'll get to see each other again. And if you have any questions that pop up, you can actually just send those into the main group chat. So if there's anything that we didn't talk about, just send them into the main large group chat, and Jared will probably be circling back to those. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yep.